I knew something was wrong the moment I saw sunlight where there shouldn't have been any. For nearly 20 years, the eastern edge of my property had been hidden behind a thick wall of oak and pine trees, the kind of mature timber that takes generations to grow and only a few minutes for the wrong person to destroy. But that morning, standing on the porch with a cup of coffee in my hand, I noticed a bright gap cutting through the tree line like a missing tooth. At first I thought maybe a storm had come through during the night. Then I remembered there hadn't been a cloud in the sky for over a week. That's when my stomach dropped. I set the coffee down, climbed into my truck, and drove toward the boundary. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Fresh tire tracks, broken branches, orange paint markings, and then the stumps. Huge stumps, one after another. It felt like somebody had walked into my backyard and ripped pages out of a family photo album. My name is Ethan Mercer, and at the time I owned just over 60 acres outside a small town in western Tennessee. Most of it was pasture and woodland that had been in my family since my grandfather bought the land back in the 70s. I wasn't a wealthy man. I wasn't a developer. I wasn't some guy looking for a fight. I raised cattle, leased part of the pasture, and spent most mornings fixing fences or maintaining equipment. Life was simple, and honestly, I liked it that way. The trees along that eastern boundary weren't just scenery. I'd spent years caring for them. I knew which ones were older than my kids, which ones had survived droughts, and which ones turned bright gold every fall. They marked the edge of my property and gave the place character. More importantly, every one of them stood on my side of a surveyed boundary that had been documented multiple times over the years. About a year before all this started, the neighboring property changed hands. An investment group called Ridgeway Communities bought nearly 80 acres next door. Within weeks, bulldozers appeared. Survey crews showed up. Temporary trailers arrived. Soon giant signs were planted along the highway advertising Cedar Ridge Preserve, an exclusive luxury development featuring custom homes, private roads, and breathtaking forest views. The phrase made me laugh the first time I read it because the forest views they were bragging about were mostly my forest. The man running the project was named Brandon Calloway. If you've ever met someone who shakes your hand while already calculating how much money he can make from you, you'll know exactly the type. Brandon drove a black luxury SUV, wore expensive watches, and had that polished salesman confidence that somehow managed to feel friendly and condescending at the same time. The first time he came to my house, he parked in the driveway like he owned the place. He stepped out smiling and introduced himself. Mr. Mercer. We're excited to be your new neighbors. I told him that was good to hear. He started talking about economic growth, property values, and opportunities for the community. I listened politely because that's what adults do. Then I gave him one simple condition. Build whatever you want, I said. Just stay on your side of the fence. He laughed and assured me they respected property rights. Looking back, that conversation feels almost funny now because neither of us knew it would eventually cost him everything. About 2 months later, I noticed orange markings on several trees near the boundary. At first I assumed surveyors were identifying utility routes. Then I noticed something strange. The markers weren't near the property line. They were well inside my land. I grabbed copies of my survey maps and walked the boundary myself. Sure enough, several survey stakes had been moved. Not inches. Not by accident. Roughly 15 feet. The entire line appeared shifted. I remember standing there staring at those stakes and thinking maybe there had to be some explanation. Maybe a subcontractor made a mistake. Maybe someone read the wrong map. So I called Brandon. He answered immediately and sounded cheerful. When I explained what I'd found, there was a brief pause. Then he chuckled. We're just finalizing lot layouts, he said. Nothing to worry about. I told him those trees belonged to me. Another pause. Then he said something that still irritates me years later. Are you sure your survey is current? Property records can get confusing over time. It was such a smooth little insult. Not directly accusing me of being wrong, just planting the suggestion that maybe I didn't know my own land. After we hung up, I dug every survey document I owned out of a filing cabinet. Original plats, county records, boundary maps. Everything matched perfectly. My line hadn't moved. Someone else's had. I should have called a lawyer that day. Instead, I made the mistake of believing common sense would prevail. A week later, I heard chainsaws. The sound carried across the pasture before I could even see where it was coming from. And if you've spent enough years around timber, you learn to recognize the difference between a tree falling naturally and a tree being taken down by a saw. This wasn't one tree. This was a crew working fast. I jumped into my truck and headed toward the eastern boundary, already feeling that uneasy pressure building behind my ribs. By the time I arrived, my worst suspicion had become reality. Men in hard hats were moving through the tree line with chainsaws and equipment. Fresh trunks lay on the ground. Branches were scattered everywhere. One massive oak that had stood there longer than I'd been alive was already cut into sections. For a second, I just stood there staring because the scene was so outrageous my brain struggled to process it. Then anger finally caught up. I started yelling for them to stop. The foreman shut down his saw and walked over. He wasn't hostile. If anything, he looked confused. When I asked who authorized the work, he pulled out paperwork and pointed directly to Ridgeway Communities. According to his work order, they were clearing development property. The problem was they weren't standing on development property. They were standing on mine. I called the sheriff immediately. Deputy Marcus Reed arrived about 40 minutes later. While we waited, I walked the area counting stumps. 18 trees were already gone. Some were mature oaks worth thousands individually. Others were old pines that had formed the visual barrier between my land and the development. It looked like somebody had ripped a hole through the landscape. When Deputy Reed compared my survey to county records, his expression changed almost immediately. He didn't need long. Everything matched. Every removed tree stood inside my boundary. He ordered the crew to stop work on the spot. About an hour later, Brandon arrived. I'll never forget the way he stepped out of his SUV. No panic. No apology. No concern. Just irritation that his day had been interrupted. He looked around, saw the deputy, saw me, then smiled. Looks like we've got a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. 18 trees reduced to stumps, and somehow it was a misunderstanding. Deputy Reed explained the situation. Brandon listened, nodded occasionally, then turned toward me. We'll figure something out. I told him I wasn't interested in figuring something out. I wanted compensation. His smile vanished immediately. That's the moment I realized who I was dealing with. As long as he thought I would quietly accept whatever excuse he offered, everything was friendly. The second money entered the conversation, the mask slipped. Within 2 weeks, I hired an attorney named Rachel Dawson. Rachel had spent years handling property disputes, and after reviewing the surveys, photographs, and county records, she looked across her desk and said, "Ethan, this is one of the cleaner cases I've seen." According to state law, unauthorized timber removal carried substantial penalties. In certain circumstances, damages could be tripled. We hired a certified forester to evaluate the loss. The numbers surprised even me. Between the species, age, replacement value, and long-term impact, the estimate climbed quickly. By the time calculations were complete, the potential damages exceeded $300,000. When Ridgeway Communities received the lawsuit, Brandon reacted exactly the way wealthy people often react when they aren't accustomed to hearing the word no. He got louder. His attorneys called the claim excessive. Their consultants argued that the trees weren't worth what our experts claimed. They implied I was trying to exploit an innocent mistake. The problem for them was that mistakes don't usually involve moving survey stakes 15 feet. That's where things started getting interesting. Rachel recommended hiring an independent surveyor with no connection to either side. A man named Douglas Bennett spent several weeks reviewing historical records, property descriptions, previous surveys, and physical monuments. When his final report arrived, it landed like a grenade. Not only was my survey correct, but Ridgeway's development maps were wrong along nearly the entire eastern boundary. Their line wasn't off by inches. It was off by approximately 15 feet for hundreds of yards. Somebody had either made a catastrophic surveying error or intentionally adjusted the line to improve lot layouts. Either explanation was terrible for them. Discovery phase revealed even more. Internal planning documents showed several premium lots had been marketed specifically because of their forest views. Those views existed because of the tree line they removed. Suddenly the case wasn't just about trees. It was about land value, marketing representations, and development decisions based on property they didn't own. You would think that kind of evidence might encourage a company to settle. Instead, Brandon doubled down. Construction continued. Roads were graded. Utilities were installed. Advertising campaigns expanded. New brochures appeared showing families enjoying picturesque woodland scenery. The irony was almost comical because anyone visiting the site could see the reality. The trees were gone. In their place sat rows of stumps and exposed soil. Buyers began asking questions. At first it was small things. Why are there tree stumps everywhere? Why is there a lawsuit? Why does the neighboring owner keep photographing the property? Then questions became concerns. Then concerns became hesitation. One afternoon, I was repairing a fence near the road when a couple stopped and rolled down their window. They asked if I knew anything about the lawsuit involving the development. I told them the truth. The trees they were looking at had been mine. The dispute was ongoing. They thanked me and drove away. I never saw them return. Similar conversations happened again and again. Potential buyers aren't stupid. People spending 7 figures on custom homes tend to investigate before signing contracts. Every time they learned about the boundary dispute, confidence weakened. Sales slowed. Then they nearly stopped altogether. Around that time, I noticed something else. The 15-foot strip Ridgeway had cleared remained completely open. No trees. No vegetation. Nothing. One evening I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset when an idea appeared so suddenly, I actually laughed out loud. My wife looked over and asked what was funny. I said, I think I just figured out how to solve my landscaping problem. The next month I hired contractors. They installed an 8-foot chain-link fence directly along the true surveyed boundary. Not where Ridgeway wanted the line. Not where their maps showed the line. The real line. Every permit was obtained. Every measurement was verified. Every post was documented. Cameras recorded the installation process from beginning to end. When construction finished, the fence stretched through the development like a giant steel scar. Several premium lots suddenly found themselves staring directly at chain link instead of open scenery. The phone call from Brandon came less than 24 hours later. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was furious. You can't do this. I remember sitting at my kitchen table holding the phone away from my ear because he was practically shouting, "You're destroying the appearance of the entire project." I took a sip of coffee and said, "I'm improving my property." There was silence for a moment. Then he asked if I was serious. "Completely serious," I replied. "You cut down my trees. Now the fence gets the view." He threatened legal action. He threatened complaints. He threatened injunctions. When he finally paused long enough to breathe, I reminded him of something important. Touch one section of that fence, and you'll be destroying property on camera. After that conversation, things became strangely entertaining. The fence remained exactly where it was. Buyers touring luxury lots could no longer ignore the dispute because the dispute was literally standing in front of them. Then I made a decision that would push Brandon from angry to absolutely miserable. I bought 6 goats. Now before anyone starts thinking I bought those goats as part of some master revenge plan, that's not exactly true. I'd always liked goats. They're funny, stubborn, curious little troublemakers, and I'd talked for years about getting a few. The timing just happened to be perfect. So 6 weeks after the fence went up, 6 goats arrived and moved into the cleared strip along the eastern boundary. What happened next was better than anything I could have planned. Those animals treated that fence like an amusement park. They climbed on it, leaned against it, stared at people, followed visitors around, and somehow always managed to be standing in exactly the wrong place whenever Ridgeway was showing property to potential buyers. More than once I watched prospective homeowners step out of luxury SUVs expecting to see a prestigious development, only to find half a dozen goats watching them like a jury deciding whether they belonged there. One afternoon, I saw a little girl laugh and point at the goats while her parents stood nearby, looking less amused. The sales agent kept trying to redirect attention toward the lots, but every conversation eventually drifted back to the fence, the missing trees, and the lawsuit. The development had become impossible to market without explaining the giant conflict sitting right in the middle of it. Brandon's frustration grew into desperation. He filed another legal action demanding the removal of the fence and arguing that the livestock constituted an unreasonable interference with his business operations. Rachel nearly laughed when she read the filing. During the hearing, Brandon's attorneys argued that my actions were damaging property values throughout the development. The judge listened patiently, reviewed the surveys again, reviewed the documentation related to the tree removal, and finally leaned back in his chair. Then he delivered a sentence that I still remember word for word. The defendant is using his property in a lawful manner. If the plaintiff dislikes the consequences, perhaps the plaintiff should not have cut down the defendant's trees. Motion denied. Just like that. Brandon walked out of the courtroom looking like a man who had discovered gravity for the first time. From that point forward, everything started unraveling. Construction delays increased. Financing became harder to secure. More buyers backed away. Local conversations about the project shifted from excitement to skepticism. Nobody wanted to invest millions into a development associated with lawsuits, boundary disputes, and a very visible public embarrassment. Meanwhile, our original case finally reached trial. By then we had photographs, surveys, expert testimony, county records, valuation reports, and enough documentation to fill several large binders. The jury heard everything. They saw where the original boundary sat. They saw where the survey stakes had been moved. They saw photographs of the destroyed trees. They listened to experts explain the value of what had been lost. Most importantly, they saw a pattern. This wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. This was a company that had acted first and worried about ownership later. After deliberations, the verdict came back overwhelmingly in my favor. The final award totaled $280,000 plus costs and additional legal expenses. Brandon appealed. He lost. He appealed again. He lost again. Eventually, there were no more places left to run. A check arrived. I remember holding it in my hands and feeling something surprising. Not excitement. Not triumph. Relief. Because the truth is, none of this had ever been about getting rich. If someone had offered me a choice between that money and having those trees back, I would have chosen the trees every single time. But life doesn't always give you that option. Sometimes, all you get is accountability. Over the next year, Ridgeway Communities continued struggling. Several lots remained unsold. Investors grew nervous. Costs increased. Revenue declined. Eventually, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. The luxury development that was supposed to become the crown jewel of the county became a cautionary tale people talked about over coffee and at hardware stores. Every now and then someone asks whether I feel bad about what happened. The honest answer is no, but probably not for the reason people expect. I didn't bankrupt a company. I didn't destroy a development. I didn't cut down anyone's trees. All I did was defend what already belonged to me. Brandon made every major decision himself. He chose to ignore boundaries. He chose to move forward after being warned. He chose to gamble that a rural landowner wouldn't fight back. The fence, the goats, the lawsuit, the verdict, those weren't the cause of his downfall. They were simply consequences arriving one after another. Even today, when I walk that property, I still notice the empty spaces where those old trees once stood. Some scars take a long time to disappear. But right beyond those spaces stand young replacement trees I've planted since then. They're growing slowly, the way good things usually do. And maybe that's the lesson hidden underneath this entire story. Some people spend their lives chasing shortcuts, trying to take what isn't theirs because they think nobody will stop them. Other people spend their lives building things one careful step at a time. In the end, shortcuts eventually run out. Foundations matter. Boundaries matter. And actions have a way of coming back around when you least expect them. So here's what I'd love to know from you. If you were in my position, would you have stopped at the lawsuit? Or would you have built the fence too? Do you think Brandon got exactly what he deserved? Or did things go too far once the development started collapsing? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that's what makes these conversations interesting. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes property lines are just suggestions. Trust me, they might learn something from this one.